to Beyond the Benefits. My name's Colleen Patterson, and I'm the Vice President of Compliance and Employer Services here at Savoy. And I'm excited because Chris and I are back together again. Chris, you want to say hello?
Good morning, Colleen. It's good to see you again. And we're going to talk about a fun topic today, something that blows up both of our inboxes with regularity and is both exciting and frustrating at the same time.
So this is Chris and I getting into our techie side on today's topic, and you can hear his enthusiasm because we're talking about AI, or so artificial intelligence, and what is that, and ChatGPT, because it is all over the news, and our industry is not immune to that by any means. And Chris and I, we were talking a little bit about this because it's definitely something that could be beneficial to some aspects of our world. But I think, like so many topics, we got to understand what it is. How does it help us? What does it really mean in our day-to-day world of employee benefits and being, brokers, employers, and so on? So Chris, how about we start here first, because you're even more of a techie than I am. So why don't you tell us all the difference between what AI is, and then let's talk a little bit about ChatGPT and what exactly that means.
Absolutely. So before we even get into that, I'm not going to bury the lead. Do not ask ChatGPT for compliance answers. We'll talk about why in a little bit, but that's your first part is don't go there. Don't ask it to give you factual answers. So AI is artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence implies that an algorithm, a series of decisions done by a computer or some sort of a process, can do the functions that are normally ascribed to a human. So it doesn't mean that it's particularly smart. It's just the type of stuff we normally ascribe to a human being. So that's AI. We've had AI in a number of different realms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not really new to our industry. So, think of things like Ask Emma, which is a decision support tool, and it's an avatar, and you can go through answering some questions, and then it's going to give you some type of response based on your answers to these questions. Another early adopter of that was Alex, which was the Jelly Vision tool, a little more sophisticated than that, but we're talking about a whole new level of sophistication here.
Yeah, so what really changed was last fall, a company called OpenAI released a tool to the world called ChatGPT. And GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformers. And what ChatGPT and Microsoft's Bard, Bing, Google's got Bard.
Yeah.
Microsoft's got a tool. There's a number of different language models out there. They're called large language models. And what they do is they predict a response that they think the user wants to see. So they scour the entire internet. ChatGPT's library is the internet in its entirety up to 2021. And so there's a lot of language out there. And so by learning that language, the tool can figure out what an appropriate response might sound like. And so when you ask it for a creative idea, give me 10 ideas on how to spend my FSA dollars, it'll come up with 10 answers. And it'll tell you things that it found across really 25, 30 years of the internet of people writing articles about that. And it'll try to summarize those and basically do word math. It adds all the words up and it figures out which ones fit in the right place. And then it gives them back to you in a formula that should make sense. And it's going to give you an incredibly compellingly written piece that is written as if somebody who knew exactly what they were talking about wrote it. That's where it gets dangerous because it looks very well written. And in the history of our society, in our use of language, we have always understood well-written to be strongly correlated with factual.
True.
There are editors involved. There's fact-checking. If you bought a book, you understood that book had an editor behind it, and that editor had a lot to lose if they weren't correct. Same thing with traditional newspapers and things like that. So what we have now is we have a language model that will tell you something in a very clearly written way that sounds incredibly compelling, but it's telling you what it thinks you're looking for. And that's an important distinction to keep in mind as you use these tools.
And I think, just as we're talking about the timing of this, you had said last fall, and I think it dropped, it was like November timeframe. So we're talking, today, here we are in June, we're only talking a few, 7-8 months ago when this dropped. And this has been a huge disruptor to all industries. So, I mean, even on the HR side, like you were given the example of, give me 10 ways of how to use my FSA dollars. Well, from an HR perspective, you could put in an inquiry there. It says, write me a job description on an administrative assistant with 3 years experience and 250 words or less. You can be that specific, but to Chris's point, even though you may get something back that's well written, is it going to meet all of the requirements that it needs to? Think of things like EEOC requirements. Does it have, any additional protections that need to be in the job description about ADA or whatever, other particular federal laws? And it doesn't necessarily return those things. It may be sophisticated enough to mention it as an important item to take a look at, but to Chris's point, it may not be 100% accurate. So it still requires you to take the time to research what the researcher has given to you. The researcher being, in this example, ChatGPT.
And where it gets really dangerous is that it's often really good. It gives you a lot of correct information, but not exclusively correct information. So when you ask it a question about how discrimination works for age discrimination in employment, it can go out and find a lot of information on that. It can give you a very factual answer.
Mm-hmm.
And if the only information it's brought in is correct, it's going to give you a correct answer. And I will not say that ChatGPT is a better writer than everybody listening to this podcast, but it's a better writer than most people listening to this podcast because it's a better writer than most people. And it's definitely faster than anybody I've ever met. You can create a 1,000-word essay on any topic in a matter of seconds just by asking it. So there's a ton of opportunity here if you know what you're doing.
And I think you made a really important distinction where you said that it's going to return what it thinks you want to know. So let's talk about benefits, though, because benefits, the difference between thinking what you want to know is benefits are facts. It is 100% factual. The copay is X, the deductible is this, the maximum out of pocket is Y. So I think that's where something like this can then get somebody into a little bit of trouble if you're going to put that in there that says, write me a benefits summary that has to do with my Independence Blue Cross medical plan as we sit here in Philadelphia today recording. But the nuances to that are super important because even in this example, when you're talking about the blues, every blues has its own unique instances based on the state that blue is in. And ChatGPT is not necessarily going to know that because, again, benefits are factual and the research that it's returning to you is what it thinks you're going to want to know. And it's going to be, to Chris's point, well written, but it may not be factual in its description.
Yeah, so a recent example, I've had a couple of inquiries land in my inbox where somebody asked ChatGPT a compliance question. And in both cases, it gave a very compelling answer. One of them had to do with the taxability of fertility benefits on a state income tax level.
Mm-hmm.
And when the question was asked by the person who asked me, ChatGPT gave them a very official answer, and it said 5 different states. I took the same question and I punched it into ChatGPT, and I got a very official answer of 9 different states, of which none were those 5 listed in the first one. And that highlights some of the factual concerns. So you would never want to ask ChatGPT, is my doctor in this network? Because it doesn't know. But a great way to think of it is it's a calculator for words. So if you've got a benefit summary and you want to figure out how to turn that into a narrative, you could copy and paste that into ChatGPT and say, write a narrative about this, or take this and explain it to somebody with a 10th grade English reading comprehension. And it'll do that for you. And it'll do it faster than you ever possibly could. You still have to go back and double check that it didn't change anything materially, that it didn't mischaracterize anything like that. But if you've got to explain how a deductible works and what the deductible is, there's a good chance you can get a good answer out of it. And that's important.
Mm-hmm.
But then on the other hand, I recently got a question about a state insurance department record retention policy. And this is where GPT giving you what it thinks you want to see gets dangerous, because it cited to the state code and it gave me a specific chapter. But when I went to that chapter to double check it, because it looked very official and it actually gave me a site, that section of the chapter said reserved, meaning there was no code where GPT sent me. So it made up an answer and it made up a part of the code. And that's incredibly compelling, because If
Sure.
I had copied and pasted that email because the recipient generally thinks that I'm going to send them the right answer, they would rely on that without double checking. And societally, we have long looked at anything with cites as being validated because why would somebody put
Hmm.
in fake citations?
Interestingly enough, in your example, though, that it it was intuitive enough to find the one statute and that one section that said reserved, and then it took its place and said, "Let me write it for you."
And I've
So
had
that's
it,
great.
I've been playing with it a lot because I'm completely enamored with the idea of what it can do.
Oh, it is absolutely fascinating. You're right, and when you can put in very specifics, give me. Create a essay 250 words or less answering this question. The more specific you are, the result is pretty impressive, just
Very
like you're saying.
powerful. But it's also given me fake web links. So I ask for sources, send me the websites. It creates URLs for websites that aren't real. And they'll look real because if I ask for a question about tax, it'll generate a website that looks like it's going to the IRS. But when you click it, it's just a dead web page. It'll be at the IRS, but the end of the address will be some page that never existed because GPT created it. So you want to be mindful that for anything factual, like you mentioned,
Right.
anything in our business, that you actually know that your facts are accurately represented in what's in there.
So I think you're right that that's clearly a limitation is the accuracy of the information because it's really the function is, as you were saying, it's really to mirror a human conversation like we're having today. But I think another area of concern as it relates to our business, and we're talking about tools like this, is privacy because it's certainly not HIPAA compliant by any means, and that's another area of concern. Where you've got to be certain, you have to be very careful about personal information going out into any kind of an open forum where it's not a secure website, and this is not a secure tool.
No, in fact, so we should have probably referenced in the beginning that everything we're saying is likely to change rapidly.
Yes, as
So,
technology does.
but the way that these tools work is they're large language models that are constantly learning. So the inputs become part of their outputs. So when you ask it a question and you refine that question, because you can have a conversation and tell it, make that funnier, make it snarkier, make it for a 10th grade person, put it in Spanish. You can tell it to do all sorts of fun stuff and
Right.
it learns along the way, but it incorporates that. And if you give it positive feedback, it rewards itself and it puts that output back into the chain. So what you want to be mindful of is, as of now, the consumer portions of ChatGPT don't have an allowance for a BAA. So you can't
Right.
disclose protected health information to GPT. So if you want to use it to help you write a letter, make sure you strip out the personal identifiers. So you can still say, let's say I want to use ChatGPT to write a demand letter to a doctor's office because I want to fight a claim amount that they did.
Hmm.
It's a great thing to use GPT for. But before you say, I want to fight a claim for John Smith for $800 incurred on October 3rd at this doctor for the treatment of mesothelioma, take out all those facts I just said and say, I want to fight a claim for this and make it so it doesn't track back to any person and then go back in and insert those things. That's a good way to do it.
And you're absolutely right because if you're putting in any kind of personal information, it's essentially creating a database at the time that you're asking Chat GPT to return some type of an answer to you, which means that someone else in the world could have access to your information if you don't scrub it. That's why it's so important to make sure that when you're using these kinds of tools that you understand that privacy is not something that you're getting through a chat GPT tool or something similar. It's not available today.
Absolutely. So the other part beyond HIPAA is that same principle applies to business information, anything you want to keep confidential. If you have a question about your personal income taxes and you don't want that to be publicly disclosed, don't put it into a tool that you know is going to retain it and use it for further development. It may or may not ever resurface, but you don't want to possibly jeopardize yourself in that regard. So it goes beyond just HIPAA. It could be business information, it could be personal information. Keep it to what you want the entire world to know in the event of the inevitable data breach.
Right. And I think that's how you have to look at any of those type of tools. Something else that I think is interesting, though, with this, and this is again another, I think, limitation of these type of tools, because again these tools are conversational, or that's what they're replicating as a conversation, is it doesn't take into consideration other context. So things like a bias, for example, that's not necessarily that it's going to pick up. So even if you're so let's think about this, from the perspective of leave policies. We get asked this all the time. How does state disability or private disability plan interact with FMLA? So if you were to ask it to return that answer to that question, it's not necessarily going to take into consideration some other factors, because a lot of these decisions are facts and circumstance based, which means that the tool could automatically have a bias associated with it, because behind the scenes it's all algorithms saying that the mass population is that answers this question, answers it this way, but that means it may not be the correct answer to your specific unique situation because it doesn't know those factors.
Yeah, and with leave, that's a great example. Colleen, you've got a pretty good large language model in your head. I've got a pretty good large language model in my head, and I cannot concisely distill down a leave question to
I got to look it up all
a
the
couple
time.
of simple words. I've got to look it up too. And I think if you're looking at any question where if you talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about and they tell you, I need to look that up every time, then this is the place where GPT is going to be most likely to get it wrong, because there's so much nuance involved. There's so many things that you need to understand beyond what the question is. So one of the frustrating things for those of us in compliance is when you see something written for one law that explains that one law, but doesn't discuss the interaction. So Medicare and you, the COBRA qualifying events. Medicare is a qualifying event for COBRA, but it's not, because there's no scenario in which a plan would eliminate somebody's coverage for Medicare where that group would be subject to COBRA, because the trigger for both of those is 20 employees. So you cannot lose your coverage because of Medicare while you work for a COBRA group. And so that's the type of thing that GPT is not going to pick up when you say, is Medicare a COBRA qualifying event? GPT is going to go and find Medicare for you and say, yeah, probably it is, sure. But it's never going to understand that there's that behind the math calculation of, oh no, this, to be able to do this, to get COBRA, you've got to have 20 employees. To get COBRA, you have to lose coverage because of the qualifying event. Medicare secondary payer says we cannot cut employer coverage. There's no such thing as a qualifying event in this case. GPT is not there today.
Right. And I think in that example and the other ones that we're talking about too, I think a good rule of thumb to remember, and I know when we talk with brokers and employers all the time, the one thing we always say is when you're making a policy or you're reviewing a policy, the first question you should always be asking yourself is this discriminatory in any way? If I put this practice in place, am I inadvertently or unintentionally discriminating against a particular population? And I think when you're talking about employee benefits and these type of tools where they are today, you got to ask yourself that same question, because likely you're going to get a response that comes back that is probably going to be biased and or discriminatory on when you dig into it, which means employers always have the responsibility to, whether you're getting this answer through a ChatGPT or you're getting it through a generic compliance relationship or any other tool that you're using, like a Mineral or something like that. They have a responsibility to make sure they're checking the boxes for all the federal laws that they are subject to. FMLA, if they're large enough for that. COBRA, if they're large enough for that. Other things, GINA, ADA, non-discrimination testing under ERISA itself. You just have to understand that this may give you a little bit of a path and a direction to go to figure out what you want to do around a particular policy, but you still have to do the diligence with your counsel to ensure that it's accurate.
So let's talk about some of the good ways to use GPT.
Yeah, because I know we might sound doom and gloom, but there's actually a lot of benefit.
So in our world, we live in contracts, but most people don't have any formal education in how to understand and interpret contracts. Most people were smarter than me and didn't go to law school, so they avoided that and all the work that goes with it. So when you get a contractual clause that's really hard to read, something that starts with heretofore notwithstanding the foregoing conclusions, where you say, why would they just not say, based on what we said earlier?
Right.
But if you get some crazy language and you want to distill it down, copy it, paste it in, as long as there's no confidential information, paste it in and say, simplify this, or explain this to me like I'm in 10th grade, or something like that. And it's going to tell you exactly what that wording means without you having to diagram out what heretofore, notwithstanding the foregoing means, because that's what you have to do to figure those things out. So that's a great way to do it, is to reframe or recontextualize language and explain things, simplify things. But going the other way, you really can't do. You can't take simple language and effectively make it more accurate, because you can't make a fuzzy picture sharp, but you can make a sharp picture fuzzy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it absolutely does. And I think that's myself. I mean, when I've used the tool, I mean, when we're looking at when you're talking about contracts, but let's be real, when the IRS drops one of their notices that's 86 pages, and I start reading, and I'm no joke, I'm only 2 pages in, and I'm just saying, okay, can you just tell me what this one paragraph means? It is helpful because then it puts it in the overall context, so that now you know what you're really focusing on as you're going through the rest of that journey of understanding whatever that material is. But I think another area that it could be very beneficial is a tool like this has the ability to compare information. So there's an analysis component to that. So think of something like, tell me the difference between a direct access point of service and an HMO. It can definitely return something like that. So if you need to explain something like that to your employee population, or if you're in, an enrollment meeting or something like that, it has the ability to do that. And to Chris's point, you can then say, give this to me on a 10th grade reading level. So it can be very easy for somebody to understand. And I think that is a huge time saver to do something like that.
Absolutely. And speaking of time saving, if you're listening to this and you're a one person shop, which means that you're charged with marketing your firm too, it's hard to come up with content all the time. But it's a great tool to use to come up with ideas. So give me 10 ideas for a newsletter. Give me an idea for a blog post related to employee benefits. And with those, you're not going to publish specific factual information either. You're going to be publishing general information designed to bring people to you to ask the specific factual questions. So come up with an angle for why an employee should contribute to their HSA. It's going to come back with something that will probably be most of what you need, or give you ideas for it so that you can then go put your flavor on it and your edits and your tweaks to make it your own. You'll want to check the proprietary rights of the intellectual property of whatever tool you're using to see if you're allowed to use it as it is. But you're going to want to put your flavor into it anyways. Because one of those things that you do notice is, if you do use these tools a lot, you can spot what's been written by these tools instantly. It's a specific flavor of writing that is not how I write. It's not how Colleen writes. It's how GPT writes. And it's good writing, but it's GPT's writing. So you're going to want to put your own flavor and spin on it anyways.
Yeah, and I think as you're talking, Chris, one idea that comes to mind, which maybe we have to check this out and see what we get. One of the questions that we get asked a lot as you're talking about brokers being able to help market their services and their agency, we also get asked a lot by brokers and clients, can you help me put together a communication plan for the year for my employees? Like, what do they need to know so that they know what's within the benefits that are in their medical plan and how to capitalize on that and really understand the value? So it'd be interesting to see if we put into ChatGPT, can you give me a 12-month calendar of the monthly awareness as it relates to employee benefits or health insurance or something like that, and to see what comes back. And as long as you're doing the diligence to ensure that the information is accurate, to do that manually takes a tremendous amount of time. So something like this could be extremely helpful. And then you could ask it to say, what type of graphics would you suggest that would be best for, healthy, heart awareness month or something like that. So there is a ton of upside to using a tool like that in the benefits world. I also think when we're talking about benefits, another thing that we get asked a lot about too is benchmarking information. Or can you help me create a survey for my employees to help me understand if they think that this benefit program is working for them? So it's definitely something that could help you with. Give me 5 survey questions that I could ask my employees about whether or not they like their health plan. And it'll give you that. And it's huge time saving to do that.
So while you were talking, I punched in to GPT give me a 12-month calendar of communications for employee benefits from a broker of health insurance and other employee benefits. And it gave me a 12-month calendar starting in July. But some of the important ones, looking ahead, in October, it's preparing for open enrollment, and it says send a series of emails in anticipation of open enrollment, explaining the process and important dates. Hold a preparatory webinar to guide employees through the process and introduce any changes and benefits for the upcoming year. In November, open enrollment, and it talks about what to do there. In December, utilizing your benefits. In January, understanding your new benefit selections. In February, HSAs and FSAs. March is about wellness. April's life and retirement benefits. May is family benefits and work-life balance. And all the way through June, mid-year benefits check-in. So I did that while Colleen was talking, and it just came up with a really good plan to stay sticky and stay in front of your employees and your employer clients with seconds worth of work. And the really cool thing is you could then dive in and say, give me more detail around June and give me some content to put on there. And it will continue to give you things. And that's an incredibly powerful tool for individuals. This is massive computing power and massive horsepower for intellectual capital that now everybody has available at the touch of their fingers.
That's an excellent example. And what was I talking, 30, 45 seconds? So impressive, Chris. Your typing skills are good too. All right, so let's
Not as good as GPT.
No. So let's kind of wrap things up what we're talking about today. So I think really the bottom line is just, when we're talking to people, you have to know your audience. Well, you have to know the limitations of ChatGPT. Just be aware of the inaccuracies of the information when you're asking about factual information, because it's returning conversational data, not facts. And I think what Chris is also talking about and what we're both kind of sharing is that there always has to be a human involvement to this, because someone still has to fact check the fact checker, in this case GPT, to ensure that what it is telling you is right. And it's got to also make sure that it is meeting whatever the culture is of the company that's looking to ask these questions, and they're getting this information returned. I think, Chris, you were talking about safeguards.
Yeah, so ultimately you are responsible for the information you put out into the world, whether that be confidential information you want to keep close or information that you put out that may be false or misleading. So you just want to be mindful of that and develop processes. So if you've got employees, you want to make sure your employees know not to put PHI in. And this is all, you could probably have GPT write these policies for you, but you need to make sure that you read them, keep the human in the loop, communicate them, and enforce them. So if you've got employees that have access to sensitive data, make sure your employees know that they can't put it into GPT. If you've got a shared account, maybe because you bought the premium version, but you share it with your spouse, your conversation history is going to be in there. So even though you're already not putting sensitive information in there, one, you're probably violating the terms of service by sharing your account, but two, know who else might see what your chats are in there. So think through the ramifications of putting information out there in the permanent record for everybody to see. If it goes to the internet, it's forever. What you want out there, whenever you enter something in there, imagine if it was on the front page of the New York Times.
I think just a good rule of thumb to sum it up is check it out. It's extremely helpful to our business, but proceed with caution.
Absolutely.
With everything, I mean, I guess everything in life, proceed with caution.
Yeah, it's a great tool. Take advantage of it, but it is just a tool.
And as Chris said, as we're talking, I mean, this is what its capabilities are today. This is something that he and I both, we play around with on a regular basis, just so we can understand what the impact is expected to be in our world. So we're watching this, all the time. And I would imagine, another month, but certainly 6 months from now, we have this conversation again. It's going to be very different because it is evolving literally by the day. But it can be helpful. So check it out. But, be cautious, be aware. And, I think it could be a good tool to think about for the upcoming open enrollment season.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.